Great. Well, good evening, everyone, and I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. I have some slides prepared, and I'll move through these, but I want at any time for you to feel comfortable asking questions, raising concerns. I think it's really important that these slides really are just serving as a jumping off point for us to have a conversation. And this is material that I often present to teachers, so I think it's important for parents to understand what I'm trying to do with teachers and people that want to become teachers, and try to think about how we can make a space for creativity in schools. But I think the equal effort for that is to how do we bring creativity into our parenting as well. So I'm also a parent, and I find that even though I'm a supposed expert in creativity and have a lot of strategies, I often find myself, and I actually have video footage of it, falling down in my own parenting. It's a lot harder to put these ideas in practice. And I think parenting is one, it's been said parents are the first and most important teachers of youngsters, and I really believe that. It's really difficult sometimes to put some of these ideas into practice. So what I'd like to do is explore just a couple things, ideas that I think every parent needs to know about creativity, and hear your thoughts as well. And then we will dive into a question and answer session towards the end. But one of the first things I think that's really important when we talk about something like creativity is you probably already have some ideas about it. You might have questions about it, but you certainly have ideas about it. Creativity is not some super technical term that's out there in the literature. Everyone has some ideas about creativity. And what I hope that we do tonight in our conversation is maybe explore what are some of your assumptions, and maybe expand some of and test out some of your assumptions, and you do the same for me. And so, to illustrate how important testing one's assumptions are, I have a couple of thinking puzzles that kind of warm up our brains and get us into that space. So I'll show you an example of one. So if you look at this, if you can read that puzzle up there and think about that, how could you add one line to that to make 6? Anybody have an idea how you might do that? Okay, so think about that. How many of you are thinking using a straight line? Anybody thinking like a straight line? So if you were thinking about using a straight line, that's an assumption that the line has to be straight, and you're going to be stuck and not be able to solve that problem. If you bend that assumption a little bit and say, why does the line have to be straight? It could be bent. And then it's very simple then. If you just add an S in front of that, it's 6. So there's 2 assumptions that stick us in this puzzle. One is that we assume the IX is the Roman numeral 9. And the other is we assume that a line can't be bent. So if you let go of those 2 assumptions, you can see a new way of solving a problem. All right, so I'll share with you another puzzle. Okay, so you walk into this Egyptian villa. Before you is this palatial hut. Inside the palatial hut are dead on the ground Antony and Cleopatra. Next to their dead bodies is a broken bowl with a little fluid spilled out. No one was in the villa when they died. What happened? Okay, so here are the ground rules of this. If you're stuck in this puzzle, you have to challenge your assumptions about what I just told you. And what I invite you to do is ask me yes or no questions about your assumptions, and that will allow you to see a new insight into how to solve this puzzle. So again, before you, dead on the ground, Antony and Cleopatra, next to their bodies, a broken bowl with a little fluid spilled on the floor. Yes or no questions. Now, if you know this, if you have the insight, wait and let's let everyone struggle. But yes?
Did they drink hemlock?
Did they drink hemlock? Good question. No, they did not. That's great. That's a great question. So no, they did not drink hemlock. Good question, though. Other questions? Think about your assumptions. Are there wounds on their body? No. Good question. Did they die from the substance that was in the bowl? No, they did not. Good question. Are there doors? Yes. Are they in windows?
Any windows?
Are there any windows?
There's doors.
There's doors and there are windows, yes.
Okay. That's not the case. Well, wait a minute. No,
Good question.
Are the windows open or closed?
Yes or no questions only?
Oh, are the windows open?
I'm going to say yes.
Oh, darn. What season?
Yes or no questions?
Is it winter?
We'll say yes.
There's Egypt.
Think about your fundamental assumptions. What are you really assuming about features of this puzzle? And ask questions about those assumptions. What do you assume when you hear this puzzle? Are they dead? That's a fundamental assumption. Yes, they are dead. But those are the kinds of assumptions, very basic, go right to what you're assuming about every feature of this puzzle. Did they die recently? Good question. Yes. Not a heart attack, no. Fundamental assumptions. Did they die of natural? This is a difficult question to answer. I'm going to say yes, it's a natural consequence of how they died.
Was there an asp in the room?
Was there an asp in the room? No, good question. Come on.
Were they murdered?
Were they murdered? No, not intentionally.
Were they old?
Were they old? Good question. No, not that old. Died recently. Anthony and Cleopatra dead before you next to the bodies, broken bowl, fluid spilled out. What happened? Ask questions about what are you assuming about what you just heard.
Did they drink the fluid?
Did not drink the fluid. Good question. No.
Did they trip on the ball?
Did they trip on the ball? No. Good question.
Did they cut themselves with a broken ball?
Did they cut themselves? No. Did they die at the same time? Yes.
Did they choke each other?
No. Didn't choke each other.
No, like literally.
Think about your assumptions. Really fundamental assumptions. Were they poisoned? No. Good question.
Are there other dead bodies?
Are there other dead bodies? No.
Are they people?
Great question. Are they people? No. Now that is a key fundamental assumption. If you hold on to the idea they're people, we'll never solve this puzzle. And I was wondering, how are we going to... All right. So if they're not people, keep going. Some of you might be moving to an insight.
Are they animals?
Yes, they're animals. Are they fish? Yes, they're fish. And so what happens? Fish in a bowl, maybe a cat knocks them over, they fall down, boom. Yes, there was a cat. Okay, so again, the idea behind these puzzles that I think is really, and these are called lateral thinking puzzles. They're fun puzzles. We use them in my family on like road trips and so on. They're fun puzzles. I used to use them in my classroom when I was teaching in public schools, and I use them in my college classrooms because I think they really illustrate the importance of rethinking our assumptions. And oftentimes, what we assume about something can really trap us and disallow us from actually seeing new possibilities. And so, part of what I hope for us to explore tonight are some of our assumptions about creativity. So when you think of creativity, what do you assume? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? You can just speak it right out. One word. Yes. No rules. What else? Thinking outside the box. What else? Everybody has it. When you think about creativity, yeah? What else? Quiet.
Blank slate, like blank slate means if you don't have a lot of preconceptions, you can start there like blank.
Yeah, blank slate, tabula rasa, right?
Exactly.
What else? Time. Other thoughts? Arts? Arts, I'm sorry. Arts. That's a very common one. Arts. We think of the arts oftentimes. Other thoughts? Unique. Okay, let me pose this question to you. If, let's say, your child was taking a math exam, for example, at school, so the teacher asked the child to write the way they worked out a story problem in mathematics. And your child writes one of the most beautiful poems about the aesthetic beauty of mathematics and how inherently wonderful it is and engages the imagination. Beautiful poem. Would that be considered creative?
Yes, it's very creative.
I mean, a lot of people would think that's creative. Creativity researchers, I being one of them, would say that's not creativity. And so that's the question, like, why? Why would that not be creative? And one of the fundamental things that in the field of creativity research is we really feel it's important to define creativity as something different than originality. It's more than originality. Is that an original response? Is that a unique response? Is it to write a poem in a math exam? Yes, that's originality. But it's unconstrained originality. In the field of creativity, what we talk about is originality. I'll give you another example of that. So here's think outside the box, kind of a clever example of it. So again, it's similar. Is that a creative way to play tic-tac-toe? A lot of people would say yes. That's how you win during a cat game of tic-tac-toe. You literally think outside the box. Again, creativity researchers would say, now you're not playing tic-tac-toe anymore. So there's a context. So it's not just about being original. It's about being original in a meaningful and task-appropriate and useful way. And so that wouldn't be appropriate to call that tic-tac-toe, although it's very original. We might say it might be creative because we're creating a whole new game. But if we're staying in the confines of originality, of tic-tac-toe, then it's just originality. Let me give you another example that might make it more clear. So if a teacher assigns a child to write a haiku poem, and this child writes a beautiful free verse poem, is that a creative haiku? No. It doesn't meet the constraints of haiku poetry. It might be a creative free verse, but not haiku. And so the idea is this kind of very simple equation that one of my colleagues in the field of creativity research who studies legendary creativity came up with. His name's Dean Simonton, and I use it to talk about everyday creativity as well. And it's the idea that creativity equals originality times task appropriateness, or you could put any synonym in there. Creativity equals uniqueness or novelty times task appropriateness or meaningfulness or usefulness. I think this is a really important equation for us to think about in our own creativity and supporting our children's creativity, and it's something I share with our teachers. So here's how this equation works. Because it's a multiplicative equation there, if originality is there but the task appropriate is not, so if originality is a 1 and the task appropriate is 0, 1 times 0 is 0, so creativity is not there. Creativity is not present. So in the example I just gave is if the kid wrote the very original response on the math test, but it wasn't appropriate for the task of the math test. So it's original, but it's not task appropriate, and because it's not creative. Does that make sense? So conversely, you might assign, if a teacher assigns a kid a haiku poem and they copy it off the internet and hand it in, and maybe just change hardly anything on it, it might be task appropriate in that it meets the constraints of haiku poetry, but it's not original. So that's a 0, that's a 1. 1 times 0 is still 0, it's not creative. So the idea is it's a both and. And I think that's a really powerful thing for us to keep in mind, because it helps us realize that creativity can manifest in many different places, and it really depends on the context. So context really matters. And so something we try to talk to teachers about, and we as parents talk to our children about, is there's a time and a place for creativity. So on the math exam, coming up with a creative poem, that's probably not the time and the place to do that. And so something we could help our children do is realize, that was great that you had that great idea. This is not the appropriate context for that. to give you a real-world example, when I was flying in from Oregon, I had to fly into San Francisco first, and so we flew over the water, and it was a routine thing. The last thing I'd want the pilot to do is come on the speaker and say, ladies and gentlemen, this is a routine flight, but I've been thinking about this new creative water landing I'd like to try. We'd be like, what, are you kidding me? No way. And so you would not want that to happen. So in that context, routine landing, let's just land the plane, please. But let's say the plane was having mechanical problems over the water. Then we want our pilot to be very creative and not just say, I'm just going to try a routine landing in this water. It's like, I don't think so. You're going to have to try something much more original and appropriate for the certain circumstances. And so I use that little anecdote to try to help us think about when we're working with children, oftentimes they can be very expressive, very unique and original. And so it's about helping them find the context to be creative in. And so it's often the case, kids do not lack for originality. I think what they lack for is support in finding the context in which to be creative. So any questions or ideas or comments about what we've talked about so far? Yes?
I'm going to train it in something that I understand more about, which is design thinking. So the way in which you're describing creativity, I understand as more akin to design thinking, where you're having specifications and you're attempting to meet the specifications in a more effective or more original way.
Yes. Absolutely, yes. So in the vast majority of creative activity or expression, even at the large levels of creative expression, always operate within constraints. Those might be design specifications in design, right? In a kitchen, when you're cooking a meal, right, you can make the most creative combination. So it's like, I have leftover Thai food, I have leftover Italian food, I have something in the pantry, let's throw this together. That might be an original combination of things, but if your family won't eat it, then you didn't meet the constraints of it has to taste good, right? So in that context, if you put together something original and it tastes good, then you have a creative meal, right? And so that's everyday creativity. But the design specifications in that context would be tasty, palatable, edible, right? You wouldn't want somebody vomiting after you serve them the meal. So I think this is a really important and subtle and sometimes overlooked thing, because if you look in the dictionary or thesaurus, creativity is often synonymous with originality only. You don't see these other components that are really important. And I think that's why we often see, for example, with teachers, I've never met a teacher who says, I can't stand creativity and I want to squeeze it out of students. But I think what teachers sometimes feel like is they think creativity is only originality. And they think, I have 30 kids in my classroom, and if kids are doing their own thing, that's a recipe for chaos. And I think it's really helpful to remind teachers, sometimes as parents, maybe if you have a child who is very original in their thinking, and it can become a behavior problem even, reminding teachers to say, okay, I understand that the expression, that my child writing this poem during the math test was disruptive, or the ideas they were sharing in class. Can you help me help him or her find the context where it would be appropriate? Right? So I think that's a way to have a conversation with teachers so that they can help support you and your children in finding the context in which that originality is an appropriate place to express. And so that leads to the full combination of the definition of creativity that most of us in the field of creativity research have, and that's this kind of balance between original, task-appropriate, or meaningful, all kind of situated in a social, cultural, historical context. So creativity in one historical period or one cultural context could be very different than another, because it's the context that defines what's considered original and what's considered appropriate. And so I think this is something important for us to understand as parents, and also to help our children understand. And the nice thing about this definition is it helps us realize there's different types and levels of creativity. So if creativity is a human trait, and it's about originality and appropriateness in different contexts, then creativity doesn't just have to be associated with the arts, right? That's a common thing. Another roadblock that I think teachers sometimes have is they might be a math teacher, they might be a science teacher, and they think, okay, if I want to bring creativity into my classroom, I need to figure out a way to bring the arts into the classroom. And it's not about bringing the arts into the classroom, it's about allowing students to share their original ideas. It's about ideas. The arts might be a vehicle for that, but you don't need the arts to be creative, you could have a chalkboard and have the most creative ideation occurring in the classroom. So I think it's really important to realize that there's more than the arts when it comes to creativity. Creativity, the arts is one vehicle for creative expression. If you do a Google search and with the word creativity, that image on the right is the first one that comes up right now. And it is this very artistic, kind of abstract, the unfettered mind and blind originality. And then there's a kind of cool one that comes up that's creativity written forward and backwards. I think it's kind of interesting. But again, I think in our culture, in the United States, we get saturated with these arts-based images, so we sometimes assume that when we're talking about creativity, we're necessarily talking about the arts, and we're not. The arts happens to be a great vehicle for creativity, but so does science, so does mathematics, so does writing, so does speaking, so does cooking, so does sports. Any human endeavor really is a great vehicle for creative expression. Now, so that raises the question then, if a student is creative in writing, can we expect that student to be creative in science? So is creativity something you have and you bring to everything you do, or does it manifest differently across different subject areas? What are your thoughts on that? Differently? Other thoughts? It could be global. It's possible to be creative in across a variety of different places. I think the important things to help our children understand is if you're going to get good at something, you got to put the time in. And you can be. There are examples of people who are extremely creative across multiple areas. Like Paul Robeson, he was an extremely accomplished creative actor, athlete, and artist. And so the thing that's important for our children to sometimes understand is when we see great images, iconic images of highly creative people, or even other students in their classes, I struggle with this with my daughters. She will sometimes tell me, these other kids in my class can write so much better stories than I can. They're just good at story writing. Or this other kid's so much better at math. They're just good at math. And what I have to remind her is, they weren't born that way. They didn't land on Earth writing these stories. They weren't doing these complex computations. Guess what? They put the time in. When you were playing, with whatever you were playing with, American Girl, it's heard a new thing, these American Girl dolls or something. So when you were playing with American Girl dolls, and that's great you were doing that, guess what? Your friend who was great at math probably was doing. Probably working on some math problems. And so I asked her, ask them. What do you do after school? And those kids are like, we're spending a lot of time on math. And guess what? They're accomplished in it. There's no secret to it, right? It's about time and effort. If you want to be good and highly accomplished in 3 different areas, it's called polymathy, multi-creative, then you're going to have to put the time in. Just because Paul Robeson was a creative athlete makes no correlation to the fact that he was a creative actor. It's possible, but he put the time in. He put the time in all across all 3 domains. I think that's something important for us as parents to share with our students and our children. Comments or questions about this component? So the idea is creativity can manifest in any domain. It takes a lot of time and effort to become highly accomplished at it. Okay. So another common conception is when we think of creativity, sometimes we think of big C creativity, like creative legends, and other times and the other kind of creativity we think of is maybe like the creative neighbor. So for example, what I call everyday or little C creativity. So maybe you have a neighbor in your neighborhood that has like the most creative holiday light display ever, right? And that's their expression of creativity. I mean, it's everyday creativity. That's not going to go down in the history books, probably. Somebody's not going to write about them. It's not the same kind of artistic display, for example, as the Sistine Chapel, the frescoes. That's big C creativity. But what about these other forms of creativity? So, for example, this was just a splash painting my daughter made when she was 3, and I thought it was pretty creative. But, when you compare it to somebody like Jackson Pollock, other people would say, well, it's no Jackson Pollock. Some people would say, I like it better than Jackson Pollock. I'm one of those people. But still, there's a difference. When I took her to Disneyland, she was dressed in her little bell dress, and she did this little dance. dance. And I thought it was lovely and beautiful expression. But again, no Martha Graham. Martha Graham is a legendary creative dancer in the way she expresses herself. Here's a creative, you may have seen this. This is a creative, or probably an original response to this math problem, find x. I love that one. But, it's not Sir Isaac Newton's, tome on mathematics and philosophy. That's great, that's great. So, the idea that one of my colleagues, James Kaufman, and I really started thinking about is there seems to be a variety of different levels of creative expression. And we thought about, well, what about when you have an idea yourself, or maybe your child has an idea that's new and meaningful only to them? So anytime your kid's learning something new or has this new insight, and only they might share it with a sibling and they might share it with you, and a sibling might say, oh yeah, I already knew that. But isn't that still a creative moment that they were having? Even though everyone else already maybe knows it, they're putting together a new insight for the first time. We call that MiniC creativity. And we would argue that not only is it the moment of creativity, it's the genesis of even the greatest levels of creativity. That it all starts with these MiniC insights. And so it's really important to help our children understand that when they're having these new connections, when they're combining things in a new way that's meaningful to them, that by definition is creative. The context is their own kind of subjective world, but it's still creative, and it's the same thing accomplished creators do. And then the thing that we can do most as parents to support our children in developing their creativity is providing feedback to them when they share an idea that's very unique and meaningful to them, helping them move to little c creativity so it's unique and meaningful to others. So, for example, you might have your kids cook in the kitchen with you. They might have a great idea for combining two things, like, I'm going to pour pickle juice in this peanut butter sandwich. It's like, okay. And so what you want to help them think about is, somebody's going to eat that. So when you take that from this idea you had in your own world, do you think your brother's going to like that? Do you think your mom's going to like that? And so what you want to help them do is think about how can you take this idea that makes sense to them now and communicate it in a way that actually makes a difference to people around them. So little c creativity moves into this everyday world of impact and actually makes a contribution. And that's one of the most important places we can work with our children, is helping them articulate and express their creativity so that they can share it and develop it with others. Yes? That's a great point. Okay, so the question is, the example of like the neighbor who has that great creative holiday decoration, where does that fit in this model? I would argue it fit in, where do you think it fits? Little c. That's the everyday creativity. Other people can enjoy it. I mean, it takes some skill and some artistic craftsmanship and probably some cash to put all those lights up. But, the aesthetic arrangement, that's creative. People can appreciate that car stop. I mean, maybe it'll get in the newspaper, but it's going to be gone. It's not something that takes a high level of professional development and accomplishment to do, and it's probably not going to have a lasting impact. So little c is the stuff that we do every day in our lives that are new and meaningful and people can enjoy and we can enjoy. And that it has an impact. Pro C is the professional level of creativity. This is where somebody has put in typically 10 years or more of deliberate study and practice and have developed the expertise to where they can make a real significant contribution. So we see this in the professions, right? Architects build beautiful buildings. Some might go on to become legendary buildings. Some might just be beautiful expressions that are considered professional levels of creative expression. Scientists write papers that get published in journals that might help move us closer towards understanding an illness or solving some phenomena. Again, it's a contribution. It takes professional expertise, but it's not necessarily legendary. Big C is the highest level of creative accomplishment. It's the lasting, legendary accomplishment that we think of the icons like Einstein, Martha Graham. Who else? Michelangelo, absolutely. And so I think it's important to think about this trajectory here, and we'll talk more about it in a moment. But what I want to illustrate is MiniC creativity is something we all have, it's something our children have. Little C creativity is something all our children and we are capable of. And that's kind of where we spend a lot of our time. But MiniC creativity is not just for kids. So just to give you a couple quick examples, this is a Pro C creator, Keller. He's a chef and fresh laundry in a restaurant in Napa. He's one of the most accomplished chefs. He's a professional creative chef. He was in Baskin-Robbins getting served ice cream in this little you've probably seen that, those little plastic cone holders. When you order more than one cone, they hand you this little holder. And he had this MiniC insight, this new and personally meaningful insight, and thought, this would be a great way to serve my salmon tartare. What he is famously now, his salmon cornets. So up top there is an image from his restaurant of his iconic dish that he was written up for, of one of the most creative appetizers, right? And the key is, he had the same MiniC insight that kids, and we all have. He just had the technical skill and expertise to deliver it, and had the venue to deliver it in his restaurant. And he's known for that, and it's a professional level of creative contribution. MiniC can also lead to legendary contributions. So how many of you have some item of Velcro on you right now? Something with Velcro? You probably certainly own an item of Velcro, right? So I would argue Velcro is probably a big C legendary creative contribution. So as the story goes, George de Menstrel, the person who invented Velcro, he was out taking a stroll in the Swiss Alps with his dog. These cockleburs up in the left corner there stuck to his clothing and his dog's fur, and he was trying to take those off and was frustrated at how tenacious these cockleburs were sticking to his clothing and his dog's fur, and he wondered, why is it that these stick so much? He took it under a microscope and he saw this kind of latch system, and he had the MiniC insight of, I bet I could make this into a synthetic adhesive. And he did, and he made Velcro. The clothing is that kind of soft end, that kind of crunchy end is like the cocklebur, and that is a legendary creation. It started with MiniC. The difference is he had the expertise and the capacity to not only have the idea, but to turn it into an innovation, right? And that's from experience, expertise, resources, and so on. So I think it's really important. These are good examples to remind our children of. That the kinds of ideas they have, given the right context, even some of the ideas they have with kind of expert support, could lead to innovations. There's a story that was recently that was kind of talked about in the newspaper of a kid who is the son of a professor at UC Davis, and the idea was he was in a science class, and his dad works in a very narrow field of science where he looks at baits that are used for pest control for almond growers. And so they typically use some sort of almond paste in this bait to kill off this orange worm, which is a key pest in the fields. And so the kid thought in class, hey, I like pistachios better than almonds. I think that maybe those orange worms would like them better because they just are richer tasting. I mean, that might be an idea that just disappears in a typical classroom. But this kid had access to a lab at a university. And his dad's colleague set up this controlled experiment. They tested it out, and sure enough, those orange worms preferred this pistachio paste. And then his dad presented it at a state growers conference. Right? So there's an idea of a kid with kind of the expert companionship, right, that we as adults can provide, that teachers can provide, that we can actually take an idea and deliver it into a real-world contribution. So it can happen all the time. I think the key message, though, is to teach our students that if you really want to take these ideas to the next level, if there's something you're really interested in and you're coming up with a lot of ideas, you're going to have to put the time and the effort in to have the professional expertise and the access to the opportunities to make these contributions. But they already have the ideas to start with. They're already putting these connections together. So what is kind of the takeaway for this? How do we develop creativity from one level to the next? From MiniC to little c, it's really about feedback. That's one of the most powerful ways we can support students who have these amazing ideas and help them develop those ideas into a contribution that makes an impact, at least in their school, classroom, home, or lives. To go from little c to pro c, it typically takes a lot of practice and expertise. Typically 10 years, 10,000 hours or more. So that's a huge investment of time. But still, little c is pretty powerful. And then go from pro c to big C, that takes a lot of time and a lot of luck, and it usually happens after people are dead, when we recognize this was a legendary writer, this was a legendary scientist, this was a legendary dancer. And so where we want to work on is have these aspirational goals to have our students and children understand that we can, if they're interested in a particular topic, you can become a professional creator in that domain. It's just going to take some time. In the meantime, let me support you on helping you communicate your ideas so we can understand the value of those. Oftentimes when little kids share their ideas, they make sense to the kid, but the way they share them, how they share them is really difficult to see what they're talking about. So I always say we're kind of blinded by the how and can't see the what. And so what we can do is provide feedback to help kids more clearly communicate the what. And I'll show you some examples of this. And one metaphor that James Kaufman and I came up with is this Goldilocks principle of feedback. So when your child's sharing something, particularly if it doesn't make sense, but they're really excited about it, there's 3 levels of feedback you can give. One is like the hot porridge, where it's too harsh. Like, you need to think about that some more, where we completely shut it down. We want to avoid that. That can actually stifle creativity. I don't believe creativity can be killed. As long as there's life, there's creativity. But we can really stifle it. Maybe in your own life, you had a creative aspiration and you were pursuing it, and one person in a split moment said something to you and you stopped doing it. It happened to me with poetry. One of my trusted poetry teachers told me I never wrote a poem again. Right? It's not that my poetry died, my willingness to do it died in that moment. It became too painful. I was too shamed by the moment. I felt like I couldn't be the poet that I thought I was becoming. So we have to be careful we don't want to be too harsh. At the same time, we don't want to be too soft. We don't want to just, paint rainbows and unicorns of like, that's so great, wonderful, you're so wonderful at drawing, when in fact there's some room for improvement. So what we talk about is it's important to be encouraging, but be real. Provide real feedback that talks about real world constraints. So if a kid's drawing something, a good way to do it is say, tell me what you have here, and let me give you some feedback. Oh, I didn't see that that's what you're trying to communicate. Maybe this is a way you could do that to make it a little bit more clear, because I wasn't seeing that. So I think we want to blend what they're doing well and how they might improve and kind of strike that just right balance. And that's the way we can let them know, A, that improvement is the road to creativity, not just some inherent gift that you've received. And so I think what happens sometimes when we give the too soft feedback, kids might think, I am so great at this, I'm so great at this. And the minute they face their first challenge, it's over for them. They feel like, oh my gosh, I guess I can't do this, and they stop. I mean, if you anyone watch American Idol? You ever seen that show? You see that all the time. You see it's usually at the beginning things, and it's really painful to watch. Somebody said, I'm going on American Idol, and they really need a lot of work. But they think they're great, and the judges just eviscerate them. And it's a terrible thing, and it's a really painful experience, and it's because they were never given honest feedback along the way. Honest meaning real world constraints, but also supportive, right? So that is the key. Carol Dweck, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She's a researcher in motivation, does some beautiful work on what she calls mindset. And she says when we're giving feedback, the kind of feedback we want to give, we want to cultivate a mindset towards improvement rather than fixed ability. So we want to have this growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. So when we say to a child when they've done something, instead of saying, you're a great writer, that communicates a fixed ability. What would be better, according to Carol Dweck, would be to say something like, I could tell you put a lot of work into this. that helps reinforce the idea that the reason why you're getting better at writing is because you're putting time in. And the reason why there's other kids that might be better is because they've put more time and effort in. They've had more support. And so I think that's a hard thing to remember as parents, because we just want to say, you're great at this, good job. And so I think what we want to say is, you obviously put a lot of effort in. And if you want to get better, you're going to need to put more effort in. So that's kind of a key takeaway for us as parents. And then I wanted, because we're kind of running on time here, I want to jump to this notion of creativity complements learning. Sometimes when we think about creativity, like we talked about, if we see it as only originality or the arts, it doesn't seem like it makes sense in the context of math or science or something else. And so, again, our children might say something when they have an idea that's very original and we aren't sure how it fits, it's not appropriate for the task, so we might softly dismiss them and say, why don't you think about that some more? That's a move that we as teachers sometimes unfortunately use. When we're not sure what the kid's trying to say, we say, why don't you think about that some more, rather than tell me more about that. So let me give you just a really quick example, and then we'll close with some parting thoughts and questions. So imagine a child is asked to solve this double column subtraction problem, a second grader. Imagine the teacher taught this child the typical borrowing strategy. Take 10 away from the 2, add it to the 6, 16 minus 7, 9. Right? And then gave the child a new problem. So let's say the 26 minus 17 is a new problem. Child hasn't seen it before. And the kid gets the answer 9. And the teacher asks, how did you get 9? And the child says, I added 3 back to 6 and got 9. Now that's an unusual response. Many teachers might say, why don't you think about that some more? I'm going to ask somebody else to give the answer. But what if, instead of evaluating it as that doesn't make sense, we just ask the question, how did you tell us more about that? Just take a moment. So how many times in our lives as parents can we just take that extra moment and say, tell me a little bit more about where you got this? So watch what happens when, in an actual classroom, a child explains how he arrived at 9. So I'm going to move over to this piece right here. Here's a little video.
See, you take, like I did last time, you take the 6 and the 7 off of the 17.
Okay.
And then take off 10, and that will be 10, and take off 7 more, and that will be 3, and add the 6 back on, and that will be 9.
Okay, so 20 take away 10 was 10. You did.
I can make it.
What was your answer?
It was 18.
Okay, so let me go back because the audio's not great on that. She asked that child, how did you get that? Here's what the kid says. I had 26 minus 17. I took the 6 and 7 and moved them over here for a second. So I had 20 minus 10 is 10. Then I took my 7 that I had over here and I subtracted it from the 10. That gives me 3. And I had this 6. I had that 3 back to 6, and that's 9. That's mathematically accurate and original and creative, right? It's original thinking. It's task appropriate. It's MiniC creativity. The fact that teacher was able to support that kid's sharing it actually turned it into little c creativity because the other kids in the class were able to benefit. And you probably weren't able to hear, but one little child, after that kid explained it, said, and this is one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard in a classroom, I disagree with myself now. And the teacher said, what did you have before? And he said 18. But because that kid shared his unique and appropriate solution, the other kid saw the solution, understood it, and was able to publicly admit, I disagree with myself. What a beautiful moment. That's an example, a very subtle, but just giving kids the time and support to say, where's this idea going? Sometimes it might just be confusion, but in this case, allowing the teacher to articulate the creativity underneath it was very powerful. Okay, so let's talk about where we go from here. I have 5 quick takeaways for us to think about. One is helping our students and ourselves explore and approach life, which is possibility thinking. One of the greatest questions you can ask your child and help your children learn to ask is, what if? What if we tried it this way? When you're giving feedback, That's a great way to make sure you're in the zone of the Goldilocks principle. Instead of being too harsh and say, you did this wrong, you could say, what if you tried it this way? Because what you're demonstrating is this is one way of doing it. You might have another way, right? So what if is a powerful way to engage in possibility thinking. It opens up possibilities. So that's one. The other is be mindful of the moment. We're so busy as parents. We are focused on getting our kids to soccer practice, violin practice, to school, getting dinner prepared, that in the car, a kid might have a wonderful idea, ask a question. We're like, wait until I'm out of this traffic. But then when we're out of this traffic, there's something else, and we forget about it, and it's gone, right? So how can we be mindful in those moments to hear what our children are saying and then revisit those, either in that moment or find a way to hold ourselves accountable so that we revisit it. What I teach teachers to do is put a space on their chalkboard called the idea parking lot. And if there's not class time to explore this question, because we have to do something else, then we put it on the idea parking lot, and then it's public, and we have to go back to it. I can't forget it. It's right there. And so finding ways to do that as a parent, I think, is really important. Then instead of evaluating what our students say first is right or wrong, teacher talk, the pattern of teacher talk that we all learn in school is teacher asks a question, student responds, and we say correct or not, and we move on to the next. When you watch little kids play school, that's how they play school. My daughter, when she was 5 years old, had teddy bears lined up, and she's like, what do you think this story's about? I think it's about rainbows. Wrong. What do you think this? I was like, oh my gosh, where did she learn that? Guess where she learned it? From me. All right, so that's the problem. When we start thinking about things that we have an answer to, it's easy for us to slip into this evaluation mode. I would say explore first, then evaluate. Just like this teacher. Tell me more about that. Then you can evaluate and say, what if you tried it this way? Okay? Also, providing balanced feedback. Try to strike that just right balance that we've been talking about. And finally, help teach our students when it's appropriate to be creative, when the risks outweigh the costs. Right? Because there's always a cost, there's always risk involved in being creative, and when not to be creative. And finally, to think about the creativity and model it for your children. I mean, I don't think we can expect as parents for our children to be creative unless we demonstrate that we engage in possibility thinking, that we're willing to take risks, right? That we're willing to try new things. If we do that, then we create an opportunity for our children to do that. If you have questions or comments and you want to connect with me afterwards, you feel free to anytime to contact me, beghetto@universityoforegon.edu. But until then, we have a few minutes. I think I have a car picking me up at 8:15 or something. So we don't have too much time, but we have enough to do some question and answer, some response. So thank you all for your attendance. Yeah, questions? Thank you. Yes, sir.
I just want to mention at the beginning, basic little thing, the consumer wrestling the little kid, that was totally unfair.
Yes, that's right, and that's the point we're trying to make. Comparing a little C, right, in that sumo example, is not fair to compare them to big C. And in fact, my poetry professor that crushed my kind of creative poetry spirit, he told me, my favorite poet at the time was John Keats. He said, you are no John Keats. He did that. He put me in that sumo ring where I was just crushed by the giant of John Keats. Of course I wasn't. I was a college sophomore, right? Or senior, whatever it was. All right, so other questions, comments? That's a great one. Passion versus simplicity? Yeah, I mean, I think passion, particularly passion is really important for sustaining the difficult work of creativity. So going from little c to pro C, you better be passionate about what you're doing because there are going to be a lot of setbacks, right? And I think it's about just keeping your eye on making that contribution and helping our students know how to persevere in the face of challenge. So passion is key. And also I think, what is your thought on simplicity? Tell me more about that.
Simplicity being sort of the goal. Simplify concepts.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think helping ensure that things are attainable, right, helps build the confidence, and then immediately setting the next goal, always keeping it a little bit out of reach, right? And that's the way to kind of build in the motivation and keep the passion alive. Kind of a both and. Yes? Yes, so both of those books are out. You can probably find them on Amazon. Killing Ideas Softly, The Promise and Perils of Creativity in the Classroom. That's a book I wrote solo. And then Nurturing Creativity in the Classroom has a variety of creativity experts and educators writing chapters about creativity in the classroom.
The other question I have, my son is 9 years old in the 4th grade. He's really creative with writing. I feel like that he's starting to have
Yeah.
that now because he was focused
Yeah.
on writing and like, how can I help him?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So here we have a kid who's very creative at writing, writes so much that the spelling starts deteriorating a little bit. I think one thing that we have to help our students understand is we keep them focused on the distal goal. You have a lot of great ideas and you're able to communicate them in your writing. If you want to get to the next level with your writing and other people can hear it, and you ask them that, do you want to publish a book? Do you want people to enjoy your writing? If so, then you're going to have to work on the mechanics, right? So that you can communicate your ideas. And that's kind of the difficult work of creativity that's the blood, sweat, and tears of creativity. But I think one way we can communicate it is, rather than the way it's sometimes communicated in school, you need to learn grammar because that's what's on the test or on the teacher, I'm telling you. But the grammar and the spelling is a means to some other end. And that means to the other end is being a writer. And so if you want to be a writer, an accomplished writer, you're going to have to be able to communicate your ideas. And one way to do that is to learn how to spell, right? And you can use tools to help that out. And you can do that at a later phase. You can generate your ideas, but then you have to do the kind of difficult work of the editing, right? And so I think helping our students understand that there's this fun, enjoyable idea generation phase, and there's the equally important evaluation phase. Creative ideas, half of it is selecting the good ideas out of all the ideas we generated. Half of good writing is cutting away all the stuff that's not necessary. And it's painful to do, but that's how we do it. And so I think blending generating ideas and the hard work of converging on ideas. And that involves learning how to communicate through spelling and so forth. So hopefully that can help. Yeah.
That brings me to this point that, how far do you really let the creativity expand in a child's life when they're in the point of graduating in a school, and how do you integrate that so that they can really see the future, that they can really, be prosperous and then really, count on the creativity more than their normal abilities that we all do.
Yeah, so I think it's about finding this balance. So creativity is this flow between divergent, originality, and task appropriateness, convergent. There's times you have to learn the constraints, the design principles, whatever it is. And again, I think we want to give, so if students are spending a lot of time learning that, we want to give them opportunities to be original within that, right? So, and then when they're being original, we need to remind them, like the spelling, you need to learn these constraints. So it's time to shore this up. And I think we can, as parents, we can do that. We can provide opportunities. So if we're not seeing that in the schools, we can say, all right, so if the kid is just doing a bunch of worksheet after worksheet on grammar, maybe we say, okay, let's set that aside for a second. Let's see what you can do with your writing. Forget about the grammar right now. Try practicing it, and then let's bring it together. Can we bring the grammar together with the ideas? Right? Can we design a scientific experiment? Think about the idea of what you want to do first, but then we have to think about what are the guidelines for this project. Now, how can you work within those guidelines? And I think one of the fun things is being creative within the constraints. So it's not about thinking outside the box, it's about thinking creatively inside the box. That's where a lot of creativity really happens. How can we be creative given all these constraints? And it's easy to say, yes, but I have to do this. And then that's when you throw in the what if. What if we still did this assignment, but we put our own unique spin on it? What would it look like? And that's how you work within those constraints. And you can kind of teach both and. I think another thing to do is use biographies with your children. Read your children biographies of various creators from various cultures. And show what has their path been like? What struggles did they have to overcome to communicate and share their ideas that have made an impact? And that can be very powerful and inspirational, particularly when a kid's working on a worksheet and sees no relevance at all for what they're interested in.
Are you finding that people with college students are a lot less creative than they were years ago because of electronic devices?
Well, I think electronic devices, it's kind of one of those things, it depends on the context. We actually had this conversation at dinner. Yeah. It's less time, but the thing about electronic devices, they provide a vehicle for content creation that have never been possible before. So students are no longer just consumers of information, they're creating content. I mean, if you go on YouTube, you can see there's amazing things kids are doing. Again, it's about putting those constraints around it. Technology could be a huge distraction, but it could also be a great tool. It all depends on the context. So it's about putting the constraints around that. How are we using this technological tool for what end? It shouldn't be an end in and of itself. It's a means to some other end. And in that way, it can be really powerful. I mean, how many of you use Google to just expand your understanding of something, or a recipe, or whatever? I mean, it's like instant expertise companion right there, but you're not just using it in an end of itself always. Sometimes we do that. We just get lost surfing. But other times, we're using it for a means to another end, right? And in that way, technology can support. But it can also hamper. Yeah, it definitely is a distraction. Yeah. And the myth of multitasking, I would say, the idea that we could do multiple things at the same time well, there's little evidence that that's the case, right? And so technology is another thing that distracts. It's a distraction, potentially, but it's also a great tool. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a great question. So he asks, what's the point of MiniC when you have little c, right? Could you just get rid of that and just move things up? I think that's a really wonderful question. The idea about the difference of MiniC and little c that we think is really important is MiniC is about your own imaginative world that only you are in, right? So it's the ideas that you have. Little c is bringing those ideas out in the world to at least one other person and seeing whether or not they see the meaning and originality in those ideas. But I agree, they are very similar and sometimes they do collapse. But the real difference is MiniC is about your own personal kind of imaginative world when you have your own ideas, and then little c is about communicating those out to the world. But great question. How are we doing? A couple more? Yes.
Well, I think that was really important what you said, because one of the things I noticed is when you talk about the child who's so excited to share the idea that makes no sense whatsoever, that there's a pleasure and an energy in that type of non-creative originality.
Yes.
That it is the heart of what means nothing, applies to no task, achieves nothing,
Yes.
but is joy.
That's right.
And that what's important is to keep the joy of the MiniC. It doesn't have to be for somebody else.
That's right.
And to keep those things that don't have to apply to a task, and to make time for recess.
That's right.
And to make time for the originality that isn't constrained by needing to create something.
That's a really great point. I mean, we hear that, like the slogan, the love of learning, right? That's what I hear you saying is the idea of MiniC creativity can be an end in and of itself, right? We can lose ourselves in the joy of having new and personally meaningful ideas, and that's sufficient. I mean, there's nothing, if we think about what comes after happiness. Happiness is an end in and of itself. It's not like we get happy to make money, right? We make money to get happy sometimes. We think of all these things. Happiness is an end. It's a sufficient final cause. And creativity can lead to joy and happiness. And that's another, I think, really important point. If our children are immersed joyfully in something, sometimes all we need to do is get out of the way, right? And just let them play, explore, and not structure it so much, right? Just let them experience that moment of joy. Because they're already there. They're at an ultimate end, happiness, right? Now, if they see happiness in becoming something, then that's something different. Then you can kind of support them in doing that. So creativity could be a means to that end. But creativity can certainly be a means, an end to itself. So thank you for that comment. Yes?
I'm curious what you do when, for whatever reason, say a teacher has, creativity is in a child.
Yeah.
But the child, the little c is all there is, and they're not going to share it. And you know it's there, but they don't want to be identified, they don't want to be classified.
Yes.
They don't want to personalize,
out of the child. So yeah, I think there's oftentimes it's really risky sometimes to share ideas in classrooms, because the typical game of school is the reason you raise your hand is because you know what the teacher wants to hear and how the teacher wants to hear it. And I think kids learn really quickly that it's sometimes not about your ideas, it's about, can you guess the teacher's ideas? It's what I call the game of intellectual hide and seek. Can you guess what I want to hear and how I want to hear it? And if so, good on you, right? The problem with that is it can squelch creativity and creative expression. So I think what we want to remind kids and teachers is, can we find another way for kids to, what is the other vehicle to express these ideas? Maybe not in whole group conversation. So if they felt like they were shamed or shut down in that space, are there other avenues to express that, other vehicles to express that? So, the idea of learning is, can you represent the knowledge? The vehicle by which you represent it is, I would say, secondary to the ideas behind it. So if a kid could represent an understanding of academic subject matter in writing, that's a vehicle for the ideas. If they could do that more clearly than in spoken word or in drawing, then provide as many avenues to express themselves. And to make it safe, to try it again. So, there are oftentimes in my college classrooms, there are students who will never, ever speak because they had a really bad experience with that. So what do we do about that? I want to hear their ideas. So finding venues, a very simple thing is to have a little Dropbox. So I have a little Dropbox, or they can email me their idea, and I will bring it into the conversation the next day. Right? And there's ways to do that live, too, where the kid can share their idea, but they don't have to be the one sharing it. Another way to do it is have kids work in groups and have a reporter share out, here's the ideas that my peers came up with. Right? And so sometimes we can support teachers by giving them ideas of how to make it safe again for our kids to take risks and share their ideas. And sometimes it takes that. One approach that I found really effective when talking to teachers is to say, this is something I'm trying at home. And it's a way that's really helping my daughter share her ideas. And I'm wondering if you can maybe try this out in your classroom so that we can be on the same page on what we're doing at home in the classroom. It's working really well. Would you be willing to try that? Because my daughter's experienced similar things. She used to love doing puzzles, and then she had this experience where she learned that puzzle time was something that if you didn't finish this puzzle in time for lunch, then you didn't get to go to lunch on time. And it was a way for the teacher to manage time. But my daughter thought, well, I better just pick the easy puzzle so I can go eat. So she stopped challenging herself. So, we had to have this conference, and I didn't want to be the guy like, well, no, I would like you to read my book about it. So, how do you have that conversation? I was like, this is something that's helped me as a parent understand how to support my daughter. Would you be willing to try it out? That's a good way to talk to teachers. This is something that I've been trying. It seems to work at home. Is it possible for you to try this, right? In school? Is there a way we can maybe find a way to work this out? Just so my daughter feels or my son feels safe again sharing their ideas or has the confidence again to do it, right? That's a really good point. On that note, I will close for the evening. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate your attendance and participation. Thank you. Thanks for your participation. Yeah. Oh, right there. Nice. Great question, by the way. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you.
I might email you about my
Absolutely. Yeah. Nice job. Good question. Thank you, sir. Take care. Thank you.